So for those of you who are just, Stephen, you're here for the first time, Ofer also, we have a particular perspective, I think, in reading Psalms that other people really don't have. Actually, we have two of them, many of us. One of them is that we speak Hebrew or can read Hebrew, and the extent to which the Psalms is untranslatable. I mean, everybody will say, oh, you can't translate poetry, and you can't translate poetry, but the Psalms are impossible to translate because they offer up so many different kinds. They offer up more than one meaning because of, I mean, I'm just a beginner here, but I think the absence of prepositions, the absence of subordination, the absence of conjunctions. So as we see, the decisions that translators make affect entirely how you read the poem. So we know Hebrew, and that's fantastic for us. The other thing that's fantastic for us is that we are educated people in the modern age. And many of us have read the great works of Western literature. And we've been using the kind of metaphor of midrash as a way of understanding previous readings of Old Testament stories, like Rembrandt's rendering of David and Bathsheba. The Psalms, let me just a second, people waiting in the waiting room. How do I do this, people? So here we go. I just want to let you people in, that's all I want. Okay, your participants. I'm usually not bad at this stuff. Let's see if there's something else that appears on the screen. Well, okay, we're done then. We'll just do our best here. View. Okay, there it is. View. Admit, 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 and admit. Wonderful. Good. I was able to do that. Sorry about that interruption. The other thing is that we read, and we have read Shakespeare, many of us. We have read Milton, many of us. We have seen Rembrandt's. We understand what's very particular about the modern mind, which is it sees things from different perspectives. And it turns out, going back to Midrash, that Shakespeare and Milton and Rembrandt are the best Midrashim there are on Psalms. And I was thinking today, really, the religious world has, the complexity of David's psyche generates Paul, Augustine, and it's a whole story that comes really eventually to us. And the reason I use this term midrash is that the best way of kind of understanding David's psyche is from categories that we have from Milton and Shakespeare and Rembrandt. The religious world has given up on these texts, meaning the religious world will not go with the complexity of these texts because it's just too much. And we'll see that especially in Psalm 22, this sense of irredeemable despair, right? And there's only so much kind of editorial commentary religious people can make in order to make it work. I mean, there are good translations, but there is a real tendency, I think, to just to push the stuff that's very uncomfortable off. And I say that because I see so few people in the religious world who have any idea what Psalms is about. Nobody, I don't see anybody. I learned, Ed and I, and have to give credit to Ed for all the readings today. We studied this together already. It's a very difficult poem. And after we read it together, I was like depressed for 2 hours. I mean, both depressed and exhilarated. I don't know, Ed, if you had that similar experience. I mean, hopefully we'll replicate a little bit of that here today. But we do bring in these two perspectives. So one is we understand the language. That's good, right? The other is we understand the traditions that these poems generated. for some of you have to take my word for this story, but the story, I've been learning this story for 3 decades already, and with many of you as undergraduates as well. Over, I see. Let me just get started and we'll get rolling. Oh yeah, over, yeah, go ahead.
Just asking, when you say this text, you mean Psalms in general or this
I mean Psalms in general as a work, and we use the metaphor of the Psalms. This is Ed's, as kind of symphonic and musical, and we have a colleague here, actually, Dr. Emily Murphy, who's working on the Psalms in the 17th century and how they were actually put into music. Right, Ed was saying that we see internally to each psalm, there's a kind of music, and then there's a music between all of them as well. Right. Finding that one out, the music between all of them, that's hard, because each psalm in a way. And I'm so happy to see people here, because sometimes you think, oh, well, we did a psalm last week. Why would I need to do another psalm? A psalm is a psalm is a psalm. And the truth is, once you get into the psalm, to the poem, so far, I think our experience has been that each one is so very, very different, and dealing with things from different perspectives entirely. And we'll see this here, I think, as well, in 22. Right, I feel, Ofer, I need to kind of respond further to what you're saying. I don't care about the historical David. I don't care who wrote the poems, when they were written. It doesn't interest me. I'm interested in the way in which who David is as consecrated by time and history. And what I mean by that is stories that Jews have been telling about David from the rabbis. Right, and so this is a construct, basically, and the Psalms is a literary work. We're looking at it in that way, as a literary work. We don't care about the real David. And people will say, and maybe rightly so, like Robert Alter in his edition, these 3 lines didn't really appear here, or might not have appeared there, or they're from some other poem. And one part of my brain says, okay. The other part of my brain says, I don't care. Because I know in the 13th century, people read this and they figured it out. And they created a tradition around the text. So that's what interests me. Okay, so I don't know how we've proceeded in the past. Let's just take it from the beginning. This is a pretty long one. So if we get very slow, you'll have to speed me up here. We've accomplished a lot in 7 minutes, though. Wow. Okay. So
make it bigger.
Yeah, I will try to do that.
So get rid of some of the.
Ofer, you're going to tell me now how to run my online session.
No, just
we're all of us here at the institute. We're in competition about that. I don't know. Never mind. But I can make it, in fact, bigger. That I can do. Right. Okay. Look at that. Okay. I mean, my God, just read the first line, right? I mean, for the leader on Untitled Chapter, but we're not going to bother with that at the moment. A Psalm of David, Mizmor LeDavid. I saw one of the Rishonim, the Radak, says when it's LeDavid Mizmor, it's David looking back on something that happened and thanking God for it. When it's Mizmor LeDavid, it's David who, in the process of writing the song, like cheers himself up, right? One is looking backwards, and this one is kind of the process of writing the psalm is a form of consolation. And Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. Where have we seen that?
Jesus on the cross.
So it's, I think, in Matthew and Mark, in both of those places it appears. It's good that we have a Zoom classroom filled with Israelis. Where else does it come from? I mean, Hashem, and you certainly know, right? Megillat Esther, right? Esther says the same thing. She quotes the Psalms, right? So already the text is such a resonant text for us, right? And the text starts out as a story about abandonment. Why have you abandoned me? Oedipus Rex is the original abandonment story, right? The man who was abandoned. And for Sophocles, Oedipus is every man. The sense that everyone has this experience of having been abandoned. existentially, right? Not right. So we'll continue. You rachok mi Yeshuati divrei sha'agati. Let's go to this text here. It's a little bit better. So, how is this translated? Are we satisfied with this translation for those of us who speak Hebrew here? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me? Rachok, so we get that there. I mean, mi Yeshuati, divrei sha'agati. If you're an editor, what would you want to? How would you want to make this? What change would you definitely want to make?
Shagati is
It's a lion roaring, right? And we'll see later the psalmist is going to refer to lions. So once you take that out, I mean, it's like that the translator, they get the dummy award for that. Like, how do they not put that in? Because they lose a whole set of connotations that are available. So Elokai ekratu, God, I call out Yom, v'lo ta'aneh, v'layla, v'lo dumya li. So I call out to my God. It's a personal God, it seems here, during the day, and he does not answer. You do not answer, right? V'layla v'lo dumya li. And at the night and in the evening, I have no respite. I have no rest. It's interesting that we've seen other Psalms in which David's nighttime has been taken up by song, by singing, or by a certain kind of clarity or ease that he has at night, that he's no longer involved in worldly affairs and he can focus. And here in this Psalm, he experiences nights that we experience, right? Of terrors, of existential terror. I'm not saying we experience that all the time, but I experience much less the experience of kind of like cool perspective that David shows in other poems. So he has no rest. But you are Kadosh, Yoshev Tehilot Yisrael. You are holy, you that are enthroned, that sit upon the glories of Israel. What a beautiful line, right? You sit enthroned upon the glories of Israel. Tehilot. Do we have a better translation for that? The praises of Israel, praises, right? Pardon? I'm not there yet. Tilot v'tishbachot. Okay, fine. Right. So v'ata kadosh yoshev, God is sitting on the praises of Israel.
Enthroned upon seems quite a liberty. I mean, you could just as easily say dwells within the praises of Israel.
Okay. I mean, I don't know where we would get the within. I mean, I like the physical aspect of it, and you can almost see God's sitting on the chair being held up by David's Psalms, right? This is really, and it's not only David's Psalms that's holding him up, right? Atakadosh Yoshev. Here's a metaphor. Does God sit? No, because David gives God language. David makes God poetic. David gives us God. Otherwise, we don't have it. I mean, we have other sacred texts. And then I really want to see I see a kind of internal drama here. B'cha v'tach batchu. Our father, avotenu, batchu. You get like, B'cha batach, 1 second. B'cha batchu, avotenu batchu, v'tapaltenu. In the doubling of the batchu. What is that? What does that express to you, the doubling there?
two conceptions of temporality.
It's always a good one. That's the generic answer usually that I'm looking for, but not at this point. I mean, I'm thinking much more poetically, really, in terms of what we know about David from that repetition. I mean, I was ready to read it with urgency, emphasis, right? I mean, I think there's a kind of urgency saying, our fathers trusted in you, right? He's about to make an argument. They cried to thee and they were delivered. They trusted in thee velo boshu, and they were not confounded. I mean, what confounded, it seems much better just to say they were not ashamed, right? They weren't, is that better? They were not ashamed? People, yeah. Charlotte, yeah, what's up?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's obviously I have a much sort of different mental image because I'm sort of, I'm seeing, Christ crucified as well as sort of David trying.
Right. Right.
But
I mean, and you see how, and you just do see how the gospel writers, by taking the line from Esther,
Yeah.
Anyway,
but what I'm thinking, I mean, this, it all seems to turn for me. There's sort of two places where the psalm turns, sort of in verse 4 and again in verse 20.
Okay.
And I get sort of, almost Augustinian sort of struggling back and forth between being turned inward, between David being sort of in cravatus in say,
right.
and trying to turn
Okay,
outward.
good, right. I think there's always a kind of drama in the Psalms. And part of the drama here is exactly, I think, what Charlotte is saying, is there seems to be, and Ed used this last time, a kind of internal dialogue, right? A kind of soliloquy inside of David's head. And then at the end, there is, what Charlotte is describing, there's a turning out. And maybe that is two kinds of something, right? It's the internal David, and it's the David on a mission. And then see, as you say, once we say that, then you can go with the different kinds of temporality that are associated with both of them as well. So yeah. So yeah, Tikva.
Yeah, I just quick pedantic note that doesn't show up in Esther.
It does not show up in Esther?
No, Esther is unique in that it doesn't.
All right, Tikva, if you're going to ruin the lecture, make sure you do it afterwards. Okay, Tikva?
Okay.
Or
I'll
do
do
it by
that next
WhatsApp, okay? It's
Okay.
much less painful.
Chazal say put these words in Esther's mouth, but it doesn't.
See, I see that Tikva, you see that I'm such a chacham that I relate to Torah Shabbat Peh, right? I don't know the Tanakh, right? Fine. So, and then this line. I mean, this is kind of a turning point as well, though, right? V'anicha tolat. That's pretty depressing. I am a worm. I mean, I saw Midrash that said, Moses said he was, I'm not going to get this right. Abraham said one thing, Moses said another thing about their humility. But David says, I'm a worm. I mean, I don't think the other ones are as negative. Velo ish, and I'm inhuman. Cherpat adam v'zoy am. Charlotte was saying before that she sees how easily Christians can take David or the Psalms and Christianize them.
Yeah, I mean, the gospel writers, obviously, they made sure to get in, the crowd laughing at Jesus, saying he trusted in God that he'd deliver him, let him deliver him.
You can see in the rabbinic tradition, what will happen is that this will not only be David, it will be the people of Israel. And here you can really think of, so much of this could be about contemporary relations of Christians to Jews. Not all Christians, right? But certainly in America, some kinds of Christians, right? And then you see the arrogance of it. You see their physicality. Tikva pointed out, it's a very physical poem, lots of body parts. Kol ro'i yaligu, they call and they laugh at me and they scorn at me. Yaftiru b'safa yanil rosh. What is that? Let's go see what the much better Geneva Bible translation says. Okay. All they that see me have me in derision. Right, this is actually an old idiom which is not working. They make a mo and nod. The head saying, I guess the mo must be some kind of physical gesture, maybe turning the lip up, I don't know. But they have me in derision. They hold me in derision. Now, when I read this, so I think of it, I mean, for me, David resonates for me first and foremost, not as him describing the people, but the way he describes the personal. And even though, especially in translation, it seems very grand and maybe to be associated only with great people or only a certain kind of people, I think David is referring to the kinds of things that people experience every single day, all the time. People feeling that they are being condemned by their environment. I mean, you know, how many times a day do we feel that? That's why so much, and the emphasis on the other story, the people of Israel, as important as it is, can't be at the expense of this story. To me, this is the real story. And then, so we had some questions about this here. This translation, I wanted to switch, as you can find out that actually this thing has different translations. I was using the JPS, which in general I don't think is better, but the translation of this was a little bit easier to deal with. Because they put in the quotation marks here, right? And they break up the verse. So this verse is a little bit problematic here. So let's do this literally. We'll read it. We'll read it. Let him commit himself to the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him save him, for he is pleased with him. So our question is, and again, this is why our sensitivity to Hebrew is so important, is how do we read this line? And the first question is, who is saying this? Now, this editor says that it's being said by the people in line 8, right? And there are most of the other translations, and they all follow things that you see in the medieval Rishonim. You know, they're whether they're reading the Rishonim or not, they're sensitive to the same kinds of issues. So that they're getting those interpretations from their readings. Just like whatever, the Rambam, just like Rishonim, Rashi, or the Radak would say. So most people read this as this being a praise of David. There's a narrative shift here. And the way I'm reading it, I didn't even express it, is other people are saying of David, yeah, let him commit himself to, let God rescue him. Yeah, God's pleased with him, let God rescue him. That is an interpretation that I think the Ibn Ezra gives. So what are the advantages of each one? Just in terms of being good interpreters of text, what does the person who, the reader who reads it the way I read it, what do they rely upon? And what do they miss out on? I mean, where, you know, from Mehechi Tesi, where do we get this quotation mark? It seems much easier to read it. We have, I mean, what the other side, what they are going to have to account for is that there's a very quick shift between line 8 and line 9, right? Once you read it in the more like, oh, it's praising David way, well, how do you get from line 8 to line 9? So that's an advantage to the reading that I'm giving, but the disadvantage to the reading that I'm giving is that this does sound like genuine praise of David. It's hard to understand how this could be in quotations and sarcastic. I just mention these things because, as we said last time, I use this idiom, an equilibrium of dochak, which means in my yeshiva world that I came from, if one interpretation were perfect, there would be no need for a second one. The second one only comes into play because there's a lack in the first one. And that's why the rabbis say of their interpretations, these and these are the words of the living God, because they all complement one another. Without more than one perspective, you don't understand things. And then again, you wonder how does the yeshiva world turn into what it is today? Okay, so now, Dov, you're going to ask a very focused question, yeah?
Yes. I just wonder if it would be easier to make it not praise if ki chafetz bay refers to that David wants God, meaning it's not praise. If it says ki chafetz bay that God wants David, then that sounds like praise. But if ki chafetz bay,
right, okay, and there's right, okay, so that David is pleased with it in him. Good, right. I mean, so there's another variable there. Excellent, right? So now we have a switch. And what is David doing here? You drew me from the womb. Ki ata gochi. Also, and the word gal also, we have to go back here. Gal, this is a very bad translation, right?
But what is go? What
God
is
is
go?
like you roll into God. That's another disadvantage of my reading because it sounds kind of poetic, right? You roll into God. Let him roll into God. Let him become one with God.
So goal is like gal?
Yeah. We can look it up as we should remember the resources that we have here, right? And then so we move from that, and now David, what is he doing here? You drew me from the womb, made me secure at my mother's breasts. I became your charge at birth. From my mother's womb, you have been my God. Got to read it in Hebrew, right? Ki ata gochi. You took me from the stomach. Me, what is this doubling here? Hebrew speakers. Mi baten bat mavtichi. Oh, it's not a doubling. It's the security of my mother's womb. Okay. And you made me secure, and also at the breasts of my mother. You may recall that we saw in the psalmist in Psalm, I think 8, that David, in one of the readings, refers to the mother nurturing her child as a kind of paradigm instance of chesed. And this paradigm instant of chesed teaches the whole world that God makes the universe in its very basic building blocks out of chesed. Okay? So now we're returning to this here. And David is saying, you made me alive, and you sustained me. It's like going back to that reading, this is my experience from infancy is that I received chesed, that I received charity. And it's manifested, it's physical, the mother and the child. Let's continue. I became your charge at birth. It's much more physical here. Alecha hashlachti mirechem mi beten. There's a doubling. Imi mirachem mi beten.
Alecha ishlachti mirechem mi beten imi.
Good. So Alecha hishlachti from my birth. Thank you, Guy. Mi beten.
Alecha hoshlachti.
Mi beten imi eli ata.
It's not. No, it's passive. I was thrown.
I was thrown. Even better, right?
So
I was thrown. So that's even better. I mean, so what's David doing here? I mean, he's addressing God. What is his attitude towards God here? What's he trying to do? I really am going to start to say, like, whenever we read poems by Donne in our Renaissance classroom, we always do a cast of characters, right? And it's usually a guy and a girl, but it's not a guy and a girl here. I mean, in Donne's Holy Son, it's a guy and a girl, but here it's a guy and God, and we'll see also as well some of his internal, he'll also personify parts of his psyche. So I'm kind of asking, like, what is the rhetorical strategy here? What does David want? I mean, in Dunn's poems, Leah, it's so good to see you. In Dunn's poems, the guy wants the girl, right? What is, I mean, when I do this, it's just to emphasize the dramatic nature of the poems. There is a drama going on here, right? And I'm kind of asking, what is that drama? Why is he telling God all this? Do not be far from me, for trouble is near and there is none to help. And then he goes even further, and now he doesn't personify. What's the word for this? He turns the evil that's surrounding him into the power of the physical, of the animal. So first is, I became your charge. You drew me from the womb. You gave me this primary experience of wholeness from birth. And I think maybe what Ofer says that helps with knowing it's the passive is, God, you're stuck with me, right? From my birth, you're stuck with me, God.
The Yud Aleph 11, sorry, Yud 10 is also not in the past, in the present.
Good.
You
thank
are the one.
Right. So, which is so
happens all the time.
Right. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ofer, but it's so important. And we've talked about tenses and how the present kind of covers past, present, and future. It just complicates things, right? So I think it's David saying in these lines, you're stuck with me, and I trusted you because you saved my forefathers, right? That's the invocation earlier of the patriarchs. When they prayed, you answered. So God, like, what's the deal? I mean, it's simultaneously what's the deal of they prayed and you rescued them, but it's also like, God, I don't have anybody else. I'm abandoned, and the only one I have is you, and you're stuck with me. And this is the experience in 13 of just this physical endangerment. Parim Rabim, Abiri Bashan. What are Abiri Bashan? And they're also these metaphors of circling, of being surrounded.
סובבוני פרים רבים, אבירי בשן כיתרוני.
Okay, thank you, Guy. You were just reading that in the right nusach. So many bulls.
I think maybe.
Right. Okay. And so this encircling, and we'd have to see other places in which there is the sense of David being closed in on, but there are other circles. In Psalm, I think 18, there is these kind of expanding circles of David's influence. Again, all these things have to resonate within poems and then in relationship to other poems. They open their mouths at me. Patsua like pihem, arye toref vishoeg. Okay, people. So now we're in the position to understand why the translator really lost out in line 1 by not translating roaring, right? I mean, I'm sure that's what the Geneva Bible does. The words of my roaring, right? And in 1985, the JPS Geneva Bible is amazing. They are careful. And by making it more abstract, the 1985 JPS version, well, how would we describe now what they lost out on? Now that we've come to line 14. I'm just asking, you know what, I'm just gonna have a drink of water and let somebody think about this and answer it.
Should have said they tore or pour open their mouths and roared.
Okay, I know, but I want line 1. What do I lose in line 1? And what do I lose in the whole poem? Who's roaring at the beginning of the poem? David. Who's roaring now? I mean,
An actual line.
what we do with this is that's our next task. But seeing this is the first thing in reading the poem, right? Just to say, oh, that is data for me, right? David is being compared to a lion because he's also roaring. I mean, these things just blow your mind away because there just keeps on exploding, right? There's so many things, so many ways of seeing it. And then, I mean, this is really depressing. Kamayim nishfachti v'hit pardu. My life ebbs away. Let's see the Robert Alter one. I think his is going to be better. So Robert Alter is a contemporary translator, and he's good. I mean, he sometimes gets things entirely wrong, but he's a good. He's on line to line. He's very good. Which line is it? Or it's further up, right? Sorry.
15.
Thank you. Like water I spilled out. He goes for simplicity here. All my limbs fell apart. My heart was like wax, melting within my chest.
That's the only way to read it. If you start making a fuss of this, you miss the point of him that it's a physical melting.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. I mean, for me, I was just thinking in metaphors of like disintegration, dissipation, right? The self. It's like the self tending towards nothing, towards non-existence. Right? That's why people can't read this stuff, because that's what's going on here. Is the self just really tending towards towards absence of self, towards no self. Then there's in line 16, there's a change, a shift. The metaphor changes. Here, the first one is a dissipation. I mean, a kind of and moisture, right? Kamayim, and the so line 15 is kamayim, and line 16 is yavish kecheres. It's a metaphor that gets picked up in the high holiday liturgy, right? When the penitent is standing before God and he imagines himself as a kind of shard and then a cloud and then a dust of air. It's a little bit of like, if you remember Marlowe's Dr. Faustus at the very end of Dr. Faustus, having lost the deal, he turns into steam. He's turned into thin air. He dissipates, he loses his self. Or that's what he wants to do. He can't do that though. He wants to lose his self there, but there's that same tendency towards non-selfhood. And here, there's this drawing out as well. Kisavovoni. Oh, sorry. Yavish Gecheres, Kochi Ulishoni Mudbak. My tongue cleaves to my palate. Afar mavet, tashbiteni, and to the dust of death. What does tashbiteni mean? You judge me?
No.
I mean, ashpa, to throw away.
You cast me out. Okay. And notice here also, there's dissipation in 15. In 16, the drying out also, somebody who's dissipated can't speak. The drying out also causes a lack of speech. I am losing my ability to speak. And because I am losing the ability to speak, I no longer have existence. I do not exist.
Yeah.
I speak, therefore I am. For David, it's not only I speak, therefore I am, I sing, therefore I am. I am a poet, and therefore I am. I am a creative, and therefore I am.
Tispeteni could also come from the word safa, meaning lip. The Radak and the Eliezer both compare it to like the lip of a pot, which could be another encircling verb.
Okay. Good.
Okay.
Excuse me. I just want to make sure we get to where we want to go. So here in 17, dogs are again surrounding Klavim. Edut Mariim. What is this? A wicked assembly. Kifoni. They're surrounding him. And here's a controversial line. Asaper kol atzmotai. Hema yabitu yiru vi.
Hema yabitu irubi.
See, the Tishbeteni, it's,
Well, no, we're now on 18. Okay, and what we want, the simple translation of this is, we have to the asaper. I will tell of all of my bones. That's literally. And then somebody has to stick in, as they did, a subordinating clause, while Hema Yabitu Yirubi. So they are looking upon me. I think it's as Ofer said earlier, it's got to be really more literal. I mean, I don't know, how would we say Yabitu? They gaze on me and they see.
Behold.
What's that?
Behold. I don't know. Refer to.
Whatever, it's like a condescending glance. So one shot is, as I said, I'm telling of all of my bones, and one shot within that shot is that I'm so dried out from the previous line that all I am is bones. I'm just physical bones. But another reading is, I will tell you of all of my strength, all of my reasons. What do we want more here? Do we want David to be asserting, I am going to tell my reasons. That's how they translate it. I'm going to tell my strength. Or do we want David to be humble, not even humble, despised, disgraced? I mean, I like giving David agency, because that's just, I like when David tells stories explicitly, and it does appear twice again, this word sipur within the poem. So, and that may make a consideration. Alter doesn't like either one of these, and he says he found another text when they count all of David's bones. It's not a saper, it's sipru, right? They count all of his bones and glance at him, and that works much better in terms of conceptually within the sentence. And I mean, at the end, what favors the reading, I tell of all of my bones, my weakness, is the next line as well. They divide my clothes among themselves, casting lots for my garments. Right here, it's like, not only is David dissipating as a person, he's dissipating from the outside as well. I mentioned in the email that you should reread Hamlet and Richard II, and we already referred to this a little bit, is that there are really two selves. There's David the human, and David the king. Richard II, Shakespeare's play, also makes a huge dichotomy between Richard's role as king, where he is ostensibly strong, and he becomes more, and at the end of Richard II, he becomes less and less king and more human, which is really why Richard II is one of Shakespeare's greatest plays, and certainly leads up to Hamlet, because you get that sense of self. So we have both of these in this poem as well. And of course, the outer garments are what's associated with the king, with kingship, right? Not only is David dissipating as a person, all of everything, the clothing that shows his status, that's also taken away from him, right? And here then in line 20, there's a return to the urgency, and there is that urgency, that word chusha that's translated hasten to my aid. Be not far off. I mean, I see this as desperation now, right? I mean, we had that interlude. First, David tells of his past, then he tells of what's happening in his present, and now he returns to God again and says, help me, save me urgently. Save me from the sword. Miyad kelev yachidati. How would you guys translate yachidati?
Yechidati, my soul.
First, you have to say it properly. Yes, Ofer, thank you.
My soul, my oneness.
Right, my singularity. Right? I mean, that's a little bit too science fiction-y, but yeah, I mean, my singularity. The Radak says that it's the neshama, And he has license, and the neshama, we know in rabbinic literature, is the nefesh is more physical. It's associated with blood, right, in Tanakh. And yechidati, it's like save my body, my nefesh, my soul body, so from the hands of those who want to get to my neshama, meaning save this, but on behalf of this, right? My nefesh and my yechidati are not identical. And then it comes back to neshama is what's individuated, the individuated.
You know, Professor, now it just occurs to me that yechidati cannot be disintegrated. The singularity means that it cannot be torn into parts.
Okay, maybe, right? Ed pointed out to me. So in the next, there are a lot of dogs here. Save me from the sword, my precious life from the clutches of a dog. In the Geneva translation, we'll just go quickly to it. Deliver me from the power of the dog. Current events, people, right? You know the new Benedict Cumberbatch movie? The Power of the Dog? Who knew from this line in Psalms, right? It's crazy. There's another thing here which will blow you away in a second. I mean, and Shakespeare, of course, Shakespeare doesn't have the King James Bible. He has the Geneva Bible. We'll see why I mentioned that in a second, right? So deliver me from the lion's mouth. And then it's like David is thinking, what is God going to get out of this? And he says, and this is why I like the Asaper going on David proclaiming his story, and that pushes in that direction of how to read the whole poem. Esapra shimcha. I will praise, I will tell your name. I mean, there's a narrative aspect of this as well, which is hard to translate. I will tell the story of your name. La'achi. B'toch kahal ha'alecha. One of the questions is for a translator or for a reader, what is achi? Who does that include?
Chai.
Pardon?
Chai.
It's my brother.
Who are the I want to know which brothers? Who is David?
The brethren, the congregation.
Who are David's posse? Who are his brethren? Who is he referring to? I mean, that's an interpretive question. One is the people of Israel. The Radak, who was living among Christians and Muslims and writes about them in his commentary, says that David is talking to all the nations. I don't know if that's pshat, but it is very inspirational, right? And you can see, we'll see the mention of Zera Yaakov, Zera Israel in line 24, which gives you the license to say, well, he's not talking about the same thing here, right? He's speaking to all people. And then, okay, so so Charlotte, you said it changes in line 20?
Well, so we end the recitation of this at the Good Friday liturgy at Psalm 20. And then in the Anglican chant, it's interesting, you skip 2 lines and suddenly it goes all major key in line 23. This is all sort of minor key till, deliver my darling.
I really want to hear, it's like you're giving me like a whole, I have to make a paradigm shift, which I'm unable to do at this point. But I hear what you're saying. To me, the shift is in David says to God, I will do this for you.
Yeah.
And then in line 24, we were talking before about the drama. To me, in line 24, and this is where our readings coincide, in line 24, he turns out to people. He addresses you who fear the Lord. And here's where and it's you who fear the Lord, all your offspring honor him, be in dread of him, all you offspring of Israel. David says to God, I'm going to do all these things for you. And then David said, I don't know how you want to do the drama. Then David says, and I'm going to show you. And I guess one of the questions we were asking before is, what's the relationship between the David persona up to line 23 and the David persona in line 24? Meaning, I kind of like, is now David entering entirely into his public persona, right? Now David is David of the mission. Now, if you've read Shakespeare, now David is the David of Henry V on the battlefield, right? Not Richard II alone in a cave, because he's wearing the clothing, the ornamentation of kingship. Yiru Hashem Haluk Hol Zer Yaakov, right? And remember, we said earlier that God sits on the praises, Tilot Israel. And now he's enjoining the people of Israel to fear him and to praise him. And then there's another shift, I guess. And I guess, who is this being addressed to? Ki lo vazav v'lo shikatz enot ani v'lo histir panav mimenu ubeshavu elav shamea. This is like a job description for God, or is this telling the people of Israel who God is? Who is this God? What does this God do? Yeah, I don't know. That's one way of reading it, right? And he doesn't hide his face. And when people cry out, he listens. Or maybe he's still trying to convince God. Because of you, mi'itcha tilati b'kahal rav nedarai eshalem neged yire'av. Because of you, from you, my praise, b'kahal rav, I will pay my vows against those who fear him, those who are devoted to him. So how do we read, why does David mention here the Kahal Rav?
Well, I will profess in front of a large crowd.
I mean, in a sense, what's happening right here is this is another performative gesture, right? David is saying, I will tell of you, I will speak of you in front of a large crowd. He's doing that, right? The text is doing that with us. We are the large crowd, right? And I mean, that's why David's Psalms is about reading in some sense, because he wants us to be his readers. He wants to engage us. He wants us to be part of his kahal.
He wants to be read and recited.
Right. Let the lowly eat and be satisfied. Let all who seek the Lord praise him. Yahalu Hashem dorshav. Well, those who will in search of him will praise him. Yechilavavchem la'ad. Their hearts will, it's translated often as cheerful. Their hearts will be cheerful forever. What happens when that la'ad comes in here? Oh, so he translates it as always. I mean, to me, once la'ad comes in, we're talking about a different temporal frame. It's not the temporal frame of what's immediate. Now David is invoking the time scheme in which he is king. And when he is king, and not just the person, the time scheme that he's in is that he somehow will lead to a future age and another version of himself, of Messiah. David is like a little bit like Aeneas in Virgil's Aeneid. Aeneas has this job to do. I mean, and he doesn't want to do it, but he does it anyway. His job is to found Rome. David's, I mean, much more interesting than Aeneas. He's much more complicated. And David's really, he's not sure he's up to it, right? I mean, Aeneas also, but David is really not sure he's up to it. And this always of good cheer, well, that's futurity. That's the future. That's the public David. This is what he says to his Kahal Rav. And here, Ofer, why don't you just read the line? So I don't
No, I'm not. I'm just scratching my board.
No, but I would like you to read the line.
יזכרו וישבו אל אדוני כל אפסי ארץ, וישתחו לפניו כל משפחות גויים.
So let all of the Yizkaru, how would we translate that? Let all of Yizkaru, let them remember, let them
Let them be remembered.
No. remember. They will remember, but in the sense of that he will always be present with them. It's not it's not recollection. It will be always remember.
All the ends of the world shall remember themselves. Wow, that's a very modern translation, isn't it? When they remember themselves, they turn to the Lord, because when they know who they are, when they recognize their neshama, then it's a natural turn. And all the kindreds of the nation shall worship before thee. Now, I talked about expanding circles, which in some of the poems are literal, but here we see David's circles expanding. I mean, he starts with all mankind, and I think and he says to God, basically, let me show you what I'm going to do, right? I'll start with the people of Israel, and then I expand further, and all the kindreds of nations shall worship before me. Let's go back. Sorry. In rabbinic literature, there's a difference between Moshel the Malach in this psalm that people say in the morning prayers on Fridays. It refers to God entering into a relationship with the people of Israel, and the rabbis say that on the sixth day man is created, and when man is created, God becomes Melech. That without man, God is not Melech, because there's a relationship between man and God. And Moshel doesn't have those characteristics. Moshel is more leading, more ruling. So it emphasizes the particular nature of the relationship between God and Israel. So there's a question that people ask about this line, Ol Dishne Aretz. Does it mean that these people will not they will not be people who are fat? We meet in Psalm 18, fat people who are enclosed in their fatness and can't speak. So the question is are they too redeemed here, or are they being
gluttonous,
or are they being condemned? So and there are two translations there. Let's look at the next two lines. Zera Yavdenu Yisupar Lad Hashem Lador. Now see, that's Lador there is telling me that the Lador up there is also eternal, right? Because this certainly is. Zera, the seed of this offspring of your offspring. So Yusapar, what is the translation of that? Will be told?
Yes.
But the subject is Yusapar Lashem Lador. Zera Yavdenu, your offspring shall serve. And how do you even translate the sentence? Let's see what Geneva does. It shall be counted unto the Lord for a generation. Well, I'm gonna nix that one. Not crazy about that one. Let's see what Robert Alter does. So he goes with the bad interpretation of those previous lines. My seed will serve him. It will be told to the master for generations to come. Okay, now let's go back to ours, meaning the Hebrew. Do we have a good translation of this? Anybody want to volunteer for us?
Of which? Lamed?
31. The Lord's fame shall be praised for generations. Okay, right? That's good? I mean, I think David here, we saw David before going with this reading, telling of his own strengths. Now, David is saying, God, people reading this story is, I performed my praise of God before. Now you're also performing that. Where the people of Israel performed that through their telling about God. Who is telling the story? Who is the author of the story? In David, in Milton's Paradise Lost, God is described simultaneously. Oh, God is the author of all things, and Adam and Eve are also authors to themselves. Is Milton contradicting himself? No, he's dealing with a problem that cannot be solved philosophically, and that the problem of free will. And he's going in different directions based upon temporal frames. This story that's being told is not only the story of David's bones, David's self, but this is the story like that everybody hears, that all of history hears. Yavu v'yagidu tzidkat, somebody please?
צדקתו.
יבואו ויגידו צדקתו, לעם נולד כי עשה.
יבואו ויגידו צדקתו.
How do you guys translate the last line? La'am nolad ki asa?
This is all the, I think, 31-32 is sort of referencing ברית בין הבתרים, כן? לזרעך אתנה. And that's, this is now he does talk about, the people of Israel will worship you to ever and ever.
Right. So there is that temporal
From one
aspect.
generation to the other.
They will come and they will speak of his justice to la'am nolad, to people yet to be born, to the future generations. He asa.
That he has done that and so forth to us.
Because God has done it.
Yeah,
that's over. That's also paradoxical that God has done it, because even though we have Mizmor LeDavid, and by the end of Mizmor LeDavid, David becomes himself, God has not done it. We are not in the stage of God having done it. We're in the stage of God saying that, or somebody saying that he will do it. And that, see, again, is to emphasize the way in which, right, this is the leap of faith that David, the public figure, makes. It's done. It's amazing that David has so many doubts, right? He has so many doubts, and yet when he speaks to the people, he makes them stronger. That is another part of our David Psalms leadership seminar, right? That David, and maybe going back to that earlier question, that drama we see internally, it has nothing to do with the rest of the poem. David says to God, now watch me do this, right? I'm going, and does this mean that the David who's more like the Richard II who stays in the cave is gone? See, that's the misreading of the generation among Orthodox Jews, is somehow, even though we read this all the time, the real David is King David. But the real David is the King David of the day and also the King David of the night. And that's also the model of kingship. I think the Radak says someplace that this song, I'll find it later, this song should be said by every person in Israel. This song is for all of Israel. Because we all have our private doubts. And then we also have the stories that we're telling about ourselves that lead into the future. And this is the greatest gift of the Jews to human history, is the belief in a future. The belief in a future that is simultaneously known and unknown, right? We know it's coming, we just don't know when. And strangely, it's that not knowing which is the seed of free will, right? And makes Odysseus different from David. Because in the Odyssey, we know Odysseus will get home. We know the end from the very beginning. We know the end from the very beginning. Here we know the end, ki asa, but we're in the middle. right? We feel ourselves in the middle. And there's not, and if you don't feel yourself in the middle, then you're lying to yourself, right? But David feels as a leader that he believes in the future. And that's very important. And we see here there's save my soul from the sword. Remember, we spoke about the Midrash at the very beginning, the Midrash where God's revelation is the sword and the book. And the sword represents death. The book represents life. The sword is, David says, save me from the sword, save me from death, save me from the version of time where everything is a death, where there is no future, where there is no book, where there is no story. And we all have these, I mean, we are, as in the modern West, because we're liberals or whatever, because, and I mean that in the broadest 17th century sense, we believe in progress. We believe there's a future. And David, I mean, and David shows how difficult it is to believe in that story of yourself, to believe that there's something to strive for, which will make the next moment significant. That's the cool thing about it, right? To believe the faith that there's something to strive for, and that itself makes the current moment significant. Because at that moment, I have the choice to move towards that thought, to move towards that goal. If I say I've reached that goal, then I've betrayed the whole thing, because you can't reach the goal. We're saying you've reached the goal. It's like Milton says in Areopagitica, he who thinks you should pitch their tent here, that person is very, very far from the truth. If you think you've arrived at the truth, you're screwed. I mean, David's in that, he's in that position a million times in Psalms, right? Okay, I went a little bit over. Sorry about that, but thank you so much for coming. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. I'm going to get a drink of water. So, and I'll come back and we can